Dale, welcome.
Thank
It's
you.
a long time to get you to come to the studio just when you're getting ready to go back, but I'm glad we can do this.
Well, I'm happy to be here. I think it's great that you do this, as I said a minute ago.
So really what we want to do is find out a little bit more about you, what brought you into medicine, what brought you into neuroscience.
I'll try to oblige.
So tell me, how did it all get started?
Not in a very efficient way. So somebody just asked me a few minutes ago, where did I get my PhD? And I had to explain, no, I don't have a PhD, I have an MD. And I was intending to be a clinician. In fact, I don't know whether I told you this before or not, but I went to medical school with the intention of being a psychiatrist. And I didn't really like too much what I saw in Boston, where I was in medical school at Harvard. And that was an era when Freudian analysis was a mainstay at the Mass Mental Health Center, where I had my rotation in psychiatry, and it just didn't really make sense to me as a scientific discipline. So I went on through medical school with the intention of going into neurosurgery. And in those days, you had to do an internship and a residency in general surgery, which I did. And I spent 2 years in the Peace Corps because I was drafted, as everybody was in those bad old days. And by that time, so I'd spent 4 years doing clinical medicine, basically, either as a intern and resident in surgery or basically a general practitioner in the Peace Corps. And I had become more and more disenchanted with the prospect of decades seeing patients that didn't, as I perceived it, have that much of an intellectual component. So when I got back to the MGH and finished my assistant residency year, I asked the head of neurosurgery, which I'd been accepted into that program, if I could do the first year of the program in research. So they had a built-in research year. And he said, yeah, okay. It was a little strange, but he thought that was okay. So I went back and did the first year of a postdoc at Harvard Medical School. And I just fell in love with it and quickly gave up. Not so quickly, because it's a big transition from medicine to full-time research, as you're well aware. But basically, I made the break and never went back.
So really, that was a transition point for you.
It was a transition point for me, and not an easy one. As I say, I mean, during that first year, when, of course, you come into it from a background in clinical medicine and you're competing with postdocs and graduate students in your discipline, which was neurobiology then at Harvard, which was very good, still is, but you feel like a dunce because you don't know anything, and these guys who are younger than you are and much less experienced in life are there, you have to defer to their wisdom. So that was a hard year, but basically after a year or so you feel, okay, I'm getting there, I'm learning the basics and I can do it. So I never really looked back.
What got you into joining a medical school in the first place?
You mean going to medical
school? Going to medical school.
Well, I'd always, since early teenage years, I'd wanted to be a doctor of some sort. And my first experience in medicine was actually working as an orderly when I was, I guess, about 16 in a hospital in Connecticut. And it was a terrible job. I mean, basically emptying bedpans and, prepping people for surgery, all kinds of menial work. But I loved it, and I did that because I wanted to be a doctor, and I admired the doctors who were probably terrible in this small hospital I was in, but I admired them and was convinced that this would be for me. But you live and learn. So of course, by the time you get into medical school and you have many rotations, you see what the different disciplines are like. You are greatly attracted to some and unattracted to others. But basically, I went to medical school, to answer your question, because I wanted to be a doctor, plain and simple. I'd never thought of a career in research.
So when you started research in the first year, were there particular people, persons, things that you did?
Yeah, I mean, this was a golden era at Harvard, and I had in neuroscience, and I had known these people as teachers and went back to them for advice when I decided, yeah, maybe I should try research. Maybe that's a thing that would be my niche. So the people who were there then were Hewell and Wiesel, David Hewell and Torsten Wiesel, who went on to win a Nobel Prize for their work in vision research. David Potter, Ed Furshpan, Ed Kravitz, all members of the National Academy. An enormous cadre under Steve Kufler, who was a giant in neuroscience then, and certainly would have won a Nobel Prize, I think, with Kufler, with Hewell and Wiesel, had he not died a couple of years previously. So these were role models for me, and wonderful ones. And when I went back, they were welcoming. They said, you know, sure, give it a try. You know, I'd done well in medical school. They were sympathetic. They'd all come from medical backgrounds themselves, so they were sympathetic. I mean, it wasn't like I was in an atmosphere of PhDs that had no common knowledge of what medical school and medicine was like.
An era when it was pretty common for people coming out of.
Very common. I think all of, in that era, and we're talking about the 1960s basically, I think almost all of the people in neuroscience then who were very successful and role model figures, I think almost all of them, certainly not all of them, but most of them came out of a medical background, had MDs. Because actually when I was there, I mean, I said, don't I, if I want to do this, don't I need a PhD? He said, no, why do you need another graduate degree? You've got one, that's enough. This was before the era of MD, PhD programs.
Right.
And so, fine, I was happy not to do more coursework.
So tell me a little bit what happened after you finished at Harvard.
Well, you need about, I think whatever discipline you're in, you need about 5 years, as you know very well, to become reasonably confident in a field and in neuroscience or any science to win grants and establish a career in your own right. So I'd done 3 years at Harvard, and I needed 2 more. So I went to England to do another postdoc in Bernard Katz's lab. So Katz was, a giant in the field. I don't know whether your audience will remember
Maybe
this.
you can say a little bit.
Well, I mean, Katz also was a Nobel Prize winner in the late 1970s. And he was the discoverer, basically, of the mechanisms of synaptic transmission. So he had worked with Hodgkin and Huxley, the discoverers of the mechanism of the action potential, and together with them were the sort of giants in the 1950s in neuroscience who put it squarely on the map as a deeply scientific discipline that was not just, clinically based, but had a rigorous electrophysiological disciplinary basis. And, he was another role model. So I think, I'm sure it was the same for you and the same for everybody. I mean, you're inspired by the people you know, by the people you admire, by, you're feeling that maybe I could be like them. So that was a great experience for me. So that, I spent 2 years in England. That was the 5-year period. And after that...
what were you working on?
Well, this was an era when I was hugely more reductionist than I've turned out to be in the last 10 or 15 years, but I was working on the neuromuscular junction, on synaptic transmission in a variety of preparations. I did electrophysiology mainly, electron microscopy, all of the sort of techniques that were then being practiced to, dive into understanding the nervous system. And the impression in the 60s was that, well, you really needed to move beyond these basic, by then, dogmas about, and quite correct dogmas about how synapses worked and how action potentials flowed along axons by understanding how simple circuits worked. And there were really a fairly obvious division of opinion about how to pursue that. So one opinion that was pioneered by Huell and Wiesel and others, Vernon Mountcastle and many other giants in that era, was, well, just dive into the brain of an experimental animal, a cat, a monkey, and find out as best you can how it works. And the other opinion, which was represented strongly lots of places, and certainly at Harvard, was, no, that's too complicated. The mammalian nervous system is really too complicated. You're not going to be able to really understand how the brain functions by looking at these billions of neurons and how they're connected. And the idea that those people were promoting, and it's been a successful idea, is to look at simple animals. And this was, again, just before the era of molecular biology that came quickly to dominate that field. But people were attracted to worms, flies, simple invertebrates, with the idea that, and the most successful practitioner of that was Eric Kandel, who then also went on to win a Nobel Prize for his work along that dimension of neuroscience. The idea was that those simple systems with a few neurons could tell you things that mammalian brain investigations could not. I don't think it really worked out that way. I think, well, both were important, but I think obviously the mammalian brain wasn't as impenetrable as people thought, and the invertebrate brains or ganglionic systems were much more difficult than people imagined. So you take a cubic millimeter of an invertebrate, simple animal, or the human brain, they look very much the same, and they're equally hard to fathom.
And then after England?
Yeah, after England, I applied for jobs and came back to the United States and took the usual sort of tour around the country. And I was offered two jobs, one at UCSF in San Francisco and one in St. Louis and at Washington University. And they were both good positions. And I opted for St. Louis mainly because the chairman there was Carlton Hunt, who was a close friend of Katz, a close friend of Kufler, had been trained by them, and it just seemed, and again, this is sort of stupid human nature just to kind of be swayed by those things, but I felt much more sympathy with his background, his interests, and the people that he'd recruited at Washington University. He had come from Yale, the Department of Physiology, where he had set up a wonderful department, and he was in the process of doing the same thing at WashU. So I made a good choice in retrospect. I mean, it was a wonderful place. He was a superb chair. Again, a very good role model for he was a very good scientist, but not the greatest. But he was a wonderful chair. And, you need that experience as well. I never paid any attention to, faculty matters. And when I came as an assistant professor, I knew absolutely nothing about academic politics, about grants, about all the things that you learn about. And he was a very helpful guide in getting through that complicated terrain. So I'm glad I went there. And I continued when I got there to work on autonomic ganglia, which are, again, in mammals, but a simple part of the nervous system that it was advantageous in many ways and a step kind of beyond the super reductionist to what I saw as a higher level. So I spent 17 years at WashU, and they were wonderful years. And, we brought up our kids there. I'm still fond of St. Louis. Again, that's human nature to like where you are.
So you like the weather pattern there?
Well, not much.
Not much, okay.
That wasn't the attraction. But Washington University is a great place, and over a period of 30, 40 years, it went from being in St. Louis, a kind of a commuter college, to now a really first-rate university that competes with the best.
So what attracted you to Duke?
That's a complicated question. I mean, I had reached an age, about 50, when I came to Duke, and you know, I'm telling you nothing that you don't know, but
No, but this is really to...
I understand. So when you reach that age, you think, okay, I've got X more years, and do I want to go on where I am now, or do I want to make a transition to someplace else? So, you know, there's a window of opportunity there where a lot of people go on to another institution, to another kind of position, and that was part of it. I was really ready to leave Washington University, even though I liked it a lot and have nothing but good things to say about it. But I was ready to go. I'd been there, as I said, quite a long time. The other factor, which was very important, is that my wife had started a publishing company with a colleague in Chapel Hill, which is 10 miles from Duke, as you well know. And so she had been commuting from St. Louis to Chapel Hill on a monthly or two-monthly basis to do her editorial work with her colleagues in Chapel Hill, and it was increasingly difficult. The company was becoming more and more successful. It's Algonquin Books of Chapel Hill, and now quite a successful publishing company. But then it was basically in the co-founder's garage and needed a greater presence, and so she was anxious to come to North Carolina as well. So the combination, rare, very rare, where two bodies have the same opportunities, good opportunities in the same place, that was compelling. And Duke, you know, is a, well, again, you're very well aware, it's a wonderful place, and I had no qualms about moving to a place that was obviously equally as good and growing in neuroscience, where it had not been as good as WashU, but was growing in neuroscience. So it was a good opportunity for both of us.
And it was also, you built the first department for neurobiology.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the South has always been a little bit behind other places. So neurobiology, the neurobiology department at Harvard was literally the first in the country in a medical school that was called a neuroscience neurobiology department. So it was catching on and quickly caught on in other universities, and Duke did not have that. They had neuroscientists, of course, but the neuroscientists were in anatomy, biochemistry, physiology, and they wisely saw that probably be a good time and a good thing to start a department of neuroscience and up the ante in a field that was clearly going to be very important over the coming decades. So they put together a package that wouldn't be today, but it was sufficient then to recruit a bunch of new faculty, and they had built a lovely new building, the Bryan Building, and again, it was fun.
So how did you go about recruiting faculty to a new department?
Well, in retrospect, with good luck and not much insight or rationality, I mean, you know, you get a sense of who the good people are in the field. My one sort of rule of thumb was, don't hire any senior people. Hire all entry-level people, because you're going to get more for your money at that level than if you hire a senior person who making all kinds of demands and wants a huge startup package. So I never hired anybody, I think, above the level of assistant professor. Certainly no professors, maybe an associate professor, but I don't think even that level. So I knew who the good people were. I wasn't that much older than they were. And I simply asked them, the ones I thought were good and could come. And of course, some people said no for whatever reason, but a lot of people said yes. And again, I mean, recruiting is, I use the word luck advisedly because I think a lot of it is luck. I mean, a lot of people who you think are very good and may be very good turn out for whatever reason to have problems and they don't work out. And I would say that I didn't have a spectacular batting average. I mean, I hired people who did not get tenure, but I hired a lot of good people too. And I don't know statistically what, would form an expected level of success. Probably higher today than then. But not everybody succeeded, and I think the ones who were very good who came, I knew they were good, but it was a matter of luck that they really turned out to be good and did good things and quickly built a reputation for themselves and for the department, and that's the way it works. Build a reputation for yourself, you're helping the school, you're helping the department.
But your own science started to change, right?
It started to change, and now this is, I think, a sore point with a lot of people, mainly basic scientists. But the way it changed, and it came very gradually. I mean, the first time I became aware of the sort of change was maybe in the late 1970s, 1980, early 1980s, when increasingly money and collaborations with industry became a big factor. And it wasn't collaborations with clinicians in those days. I mean, people were not putting pressure on you to do something that was medically relevant. They were putting pressure on you to get more money. And it was seen that industry was a wonderful source of collaboration with universities that could accomplish a greater revenue stream for the universities. But those days were still rich in NIH dollars compared to today. And I think it's complex why all that happened. And future historians will no doubt have much to say about it if they haven't already. But there was a real sea change in biomedical science, I would say, beginning in the late 1970s, going on through today, when people like me who came into it with the idea and the reality that you could do pretty much whatever you felt like in terms of your curiosity and your interests, and that you get money to do that. You didn't really worry too much about, no one was saying, get another grant. Every 5 years you applied for a grant. If you were halfway decent, you got it. You did what you wanted to do. That gradually started changing in the late 1970s with pressure to get more grants, more money, greater revenue stream for the school. And I'm not sure of all you probably understand much better than I do what all the factors that went into that have been and continue to be, but the upshot was that increasingly there was pressure from others to do a certain kind of science. And if your department chair thought you were not doing something that was useful to the department and the school, he or she might tell you that, oh, gee, why don't you think about, that never happened in the era in which I started. And it was a wonderful era, and the good old days always look better. This is, again, just a part of human nature, but it was indeed a wonderful time. Many people have written about it. I mean, the people who've been successful in that era have said publicly that they probably couldn't do today what they did then because the atmosphere has changed, the support has changed, the demands have changed, and I'm not sure I would go into research. I mean, if I were where I was when I was in my late 20s, I'd probably have stuck with medicine and gone on and done something in clinical medicine. I think today it's very difficult. I mean, the idea that you have to spend so much time writing grants, so much trouble worrying about your status in terms of impact factors and publications. This just wasn't part of the equation then, and it was a big help. and made people do things that I think were imaginative, not always, of course, but you were free to do whatever the hell you wanted, and that was a big plus.
It was more curiosity-driven,
Yeah.
passion-driven,
Yeah,
rather than
yeah,
goal-driven.
right. And, you're always subject to, what other people are doing and what people consider an important question, but harder today to not be driven to sort of the mean, and the mean is not where you want to be.
So that led to looking at the big picture.
So when I came to Duke, and it was very good for me, at that point, as I say, I was by then in 50 or my early 50s, I decided, well, what I had been doing in the peripheral nervous system, which had been quite successful, that I really should spend the rest of the allotted time, whatever that might be, to trying to understand how these issues applied to the brain and to go forward in sort of a more imaginative way than I had done in the past. And I took advantage of coming to Duke to do that. I mean, I had better support. I had equally great freedom to do what I wanted to do. And gradually transitioned to an interest in vision and perception and audition, which were very different than what I had been doing at Washington University. So I credit Duke with giving me the opportunity to do all that. And again, I don't know whether it could happen today for a chair coming in. I mean, other things are expected. But it worked very well for me. And
was it a question you were always interested in?
well, as I say, I wanted to go into the field because I was interested in psychiatry.
Yeah.
And
So you
I mean, that
got
says
back
it all,
into
right?
it,
So
yeah.
as an undergraduate,
Right.
I was a philosophy major. I've been very interested in the sort of larger questions always, and the brain is certainly in biology the largest unanswered domain that still remains. So I'd, of course, always been interested in that, and all the things I thought about doing, whether it was psychiatry or neurosurgery, had all been sort of brain-centric. So I was prepared to get back into sort of a larger domain. So it wasn't like I suddenly saw something different, but I saw the opportunity to try towards the last phase of my career to try and do something that I thought was, let's say, more freewheeling.
So is that how you got back into really looking at, it's almost like you went back to the 19th century to
Yeah,
pull things
well,
in.
I'm glad you raised that point. I mean, I'd always been, even in doing the peripheral things, I mean, I'm very impressed by questions that have been long-standing. So in the peripheral nervous system, I was a big fan of John Langley, a 19th century physiologist who was a giant in his time. He discovered basically the fundamentals of the autonomic system, how it worked. He was the one who set up the whole idea of chemical neurotransmission. But the questions that he'd been asking had stood for many, many years, and I took some of them up again. And I've always liked the idea that if a question's been out there for a very long time, it's probably a good question. And that's a nice guide to something that you want to think carefully about doing. And of course, the fact that it's been out there a long time may mean it's just stupid. So the question of what's consciousness, for example, has been out there a long time, but maybe it's kind of a stupid question. But there are a lot of questions that are much more focused, much more answerable, and questions about perception, vision, what's it about at some pretty fundamental level was very attractive. So what the kind of framework for me is that, and I've thought probably more about Hubel and Wiesel and their work in the visual system over the last 15 years than anybody else's work. They did a wonderful job. Their Nobel Prize was more deserved than any other neuroscientist, I think, in the 20th century. And they remain the iconic figures of 20th century neuroscience. But they didn't answer the basic question what they did. And it wasn't their fault. I mean, it wasn't their purpose to explain what is it that we end up seeing. That's the end product of vision. Their purpose was to say, well, what happens from the retina to the next station, the lateral geniculate in the thalamus? What happens from the geniculate to the brain? What happens in the higher regions of the brain? It wasn't their purpose to ask, how do we actually perceive the world? They didn't answer that. They didn't try to answer it, but they provided the wherewithal to think about that. You couldn't have thought about it before their work, really. But it was the unanswered piece in their work, and the unanswered piece that had then stood for 50 years, they started in the late 1950s, was very attractive for me. Could there be something deep to be said about that that could be explored in a way that people really hadn't thought about? So that for me was the motivation.
You also got interested in hearing.
Hearing, because hearing, I mean, vision has been the #1 system in neuroscience for a very long time. Audition's still playing catch up. But of course, what is sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. I mean, if you have a theory of how vision works, then that theory ought to apply to other sensory modalities, and audition is the logical one to look at. So that was, you know, the basis for the interest in looking at audition, thinking about speech and music and aspects of auditory perception that are obviously critically important and also fascinating in their own right.
So you wrote the book, Why We See What We Do, right?
Yeah, and I think you know, I'm an inveterate writer. I like to do it, and I think it's a good thing to do. So that was an effort of trying to pull together the ideas that evolved gradually over a period of 15 years to say, look, here's what the problem is. Here's what at least one person, perhaps completely wrongly, but at least one person thinks the answer is. And whether you like it or not, you ought to think about it. And so I think that's the purpose of any writing, to sort of stimulate somebody else to take on something you're proposing.
So if someone wants to know what's the essence of the book?
The essence of the book is very simple, and I doubt that it's simple enough, but it's mind-bogglingly difficult to wrap your head around. The essence of the book is that when you look at the psychophysical data, that is to say, what subjects report they actually see in terms of lightness, darkness, color, motion, geometrical forms, it's very clear that we don't see the world in the way it is physically. That applies to all of those domains, and you can, this is not something new. I mean, this is data that's been out there for 100 years that makes it all the more challenging. So the question is, why is it that we don't see the world the way it is physically, and how is it that we behave successfully in the world when what we see is not physically the same as what we have to behave in terms of? Obviously, we need to survive in the world. If you don't see things the way they are physically, measured with protractors, rulers, photometers, then how is it that we do so well when there's this obvious discord between the physical world and the subjective perceptual world? And the answer is, in a nutshell, that vision works in a completely, in my opinion, and it's just that because this is still a grossly minority opinion, that it works in a completely different way than you would imagine. The imagined obvious way that vision would work is, well, okay, it detects features in images, it analyzes those, does computational algorithms, executes computational algorithms, and basically represents in your brain the world. But that's really not what's happening. And I think to understand that more deeply, of course, read the book or
Okay. And I think the same thing is for hearing when you talk.
Absolutely. So this problem has a name. It's called the inverse problem. That is, how do you get back from a sensory stimulus back to the world of reality so that you can behave in it with success? And the same problem is more difficult to convince people of in audition, but it exists. It's very much the same thing. This inverse problem. How do you get back from a sensory stimulus that doesn't really tell you, doesn't have the information? Logically, it can't tell you what's in the world. How do you use that information to behave successfully?
So how do you frame it to operate in the real world?
How do you frame it to operate in the real world? Well, the way I've framed it is, and with many colleagues over now a long time, many very good people that I've had the good fortune to work with. The answer is that, believe it or not, what we see, what we hear is a reflex response. It's no different than this. And that's very, very counterintuitive because we're conscious of what we see, and to imagine that what we see is just an automatic response to a stimulus in the same way that this at the level of the spinal cord is an automatic response to stretching the sensory receptors in the quadriceps. People have a lot of trouble. It's so different from what you imagine. It's so different from what you are impelled to believe because you're conscious. I mean, you look out there, I see you, I see your red necktie, your blue shirt, very good for television. And
so it's counterintuitive.
Counterintuitive big time, yeah. It just doesn't make sense to most people. So, I have arguments every day, and I've always had with people in the lab about, what the pros and cons of this idea are. And they come around, but it's not something that you hear one day and say, oh yeah, great.
It has a lot of implications for clinical medicine.
It has a lot of implications, and those implications, I think, are fairly far in the future, but it has lots of them, yeah.
Probably not that far in the future, but anyway. To get back to a little bit about how we managed to get you to Singapore, and maybe even before Singapore, you created a Center for Cognitive Neuroscience.
Yeah, I mean, it was there. I didn't really create it from scratch. I created the neurobiology department from scratch, but the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience had been started a few years before, and I had basically stepped down from being the chair of neurobiology. I'd been the chair for 13 years. That was long enough. They needed somebody who was more attuned to the issues that were then needing to be addressed. And that was really not me. I mean, the translational clinical issues was not my interest. Cognitive neuroscience was much closer to what I was working on and my interest. So it was just my good luck that they needed somebody to step into the position of the person who left. And I was happy to do that. I mean, I would basically I had no administrative duties. I'd always done that. I've always enjoyed that. It's never really interfered very much with what I've done scientifically. So I was happy to do that. And indeed, it worked out well. I felt much more comfortable in that. But then again, by the time I'd done that for 6 years, I was over 70, and now time for somebody else to take over. And a very good person was available to take over and did, so I stepped down from that. And the Singapore thing, as you know very well, was another great opportunity that just kind of fell in my lap to keep going with a new experience, a new challenge, and frankly with a bundle of support that allowed me to go on at an advanced stage running a full-size lab.
So how's the experience been?
It's been wonderful. I mean, in every respect, for me, it's been great. I mean, I've met so many terrific people, but it's not just that. I mean, there are terrific people every place, but I think to have a chance to know something about this part of the world, to see another country, how it functions, and to have participated in a medical school that's very different from Duke, even though it bears the same name, with, I don't want to embarrass you, but with wonderful leadership, with you and Pat, and before you, Sandy Williams, trying to do things in a different way, with a different curriculum, with a different way of establishing not departments but programs, all, you know, novel for me and quite wonderful. So the geography, the many pluses of Singapore, many pluses of the medical school, what it's accomplished, how it was done in a very short period of time with the collaboration of the government here. You know, this was what can I say, a very, very special opportunity that I'm grateful for, deeply grateful for.
For us. You really played a major role.
Well,
in
I can't take too much credit. I mean, I stepped into a fully operational system. It wasn't like you and Pat and Sandy who'd come when, you know, the school was over at the other campus and things were very, very much more difficult. I mean, I never knew that campus. I came into this as a brand new building and many people already that had been hired in the department. It was relatively very easy to keep it going.
So over the years, you've always been somebody that the institutions turn to whenever they're looking for new people, when they're planning new things. And you've been seen, I think, as a wise guide for the institution over the years, at least at Duke. Tell me a little bit about, as somebody who's young people who are starting, you never know where the journey is going to go. But what kind of advice would you give some of the neuroscientists who have been here working with you?
That's a very hard question. That really is the hardest question that you've asked. So, again, as you're very well aware, I mean, you gradually learn. You're always on a learning curve, whether it's in science, administration, with your wider set of acquaintances in your domain to understand who's good, who's bad, and why, what you're looking for in a hire, what you're looking for in a scientific problem. It only comes with experience. I mean, some people, I guess, are quick learners and some people slower. And I guess I don't see myself as a particularly quick learner in this, but I've been around a long time. And, you know, I've now been in academic medical life for the better part of 50 years. So, you know, you learn a lot. What advice would I give people? I mean, I think it's difficult today. I think you really, much more than the casual way I got into it, well, maybe I'll try it and see how it goes. I think today you have to have a deeper commitment to what you want to do and find that commitment earlier than I did. I mean, I was 30 by the time I really decided, okay, I'm going to try research. And I was 35 by the time I got my first job. I mean, that's not efficient. So I think you have to be committed earlier. You have to be smarter about making choices early on by figuring out what you really want to do. And that's not easy. I mean, sometimes you just have to try things until you see, gee, I thought this would be great, but turns out to be less great. I mean, that was my experience in neurosurgery. Not that it's bad, it just wasn't what I had anticipated it to be. So I think that's deciding what your personality is in terms of clinical medicine, research, the mix of the two, where you want to do that, whether you want to exercise it in a private setting, an academic setting. I mean, I'm a great fan, of course, of academic settings and don't know any other, but I think it's still a wonderful life. But it's a harder life than it was when I got into the game. And I think people have to be more astute than I was in figuring out early on who you are, what you want to do. I kind of drifted into it thinking, well, probably I'd be a surgeon, and then, well, maybe that's not so good. I don't think that luxury, you can't waste any years these days. You have to be more astute.
Bill, thank you, and I wish you the very best as you go back to Duke, and I think Duke is always going to look forward to having you back.
I hope so. So, I mean, I thank you from the bottom of my heart for the opportunities that I've had here. It's been a wonderful experience, And I envy, I think, anybody who is been involved with Duke-NUS over the past 7, 8, 9. How long do you measure the whole extent of it now?
2005, 8.
8. I think anybody who's been involved over that period is lucky to have had that opportunity. Certainly I have. So I thank you.
Thanks, and the pleasure was ours. Thank you.